Hello, pattern readers. Today I'm going to be talking spoiler-free about two adaptations, the recently released Shadow and Bone and the upcoming The Wheel of Time. I also plan another Shadow and Bone video, which will contain full spoilers. That will be part of my Lessons from Fantasy Adaptations series. But today I just want to talk in depth about one major decision made by the adaptation. Why I think this one big change from book to screen was a brilliant idea, and later I'm going to talk about how it might apply to The Wheel of Time. Since I am keeping this video spoiler-free, if you're someone who's wondering, should I check out the TV show or the books, this can count as a sort of review for you. It might be useful. It's safe to watch no matter where you are in watching Shadow and Bone or reading the Grishaverse, and it's going to be interesting even if you've finished both of those like I have. I am going to be talking just general plot setups, broad overviews of structures of books and seasons, but I'm going to avoid giving away any plot details that would spoil a viewing or reading experience. So unless you're someone who is extremely spoiler averse, likes to know nothing ahead of time going into something, then this video should be safe for you. In order to have some context for this big change I'm going to be discussing, I'll give you a little overview of Leigh Bardugo's Grishaverse books, in case you haven't read them. The original trilogy starts with a book also titled Shadow and Bone, and the main events of the first season cover this book. This trilogy is set in the country of Ravka and centers around the character Alina Starkov, who is the only POV character in that trilogy. Following the trilogy in chronology as well as publication order is the Six of Crows duology, which is mainly set in another part of the world, the island nation of Kerch. This duology features characters who are also in the first season, Kaz, Inej, and Jesper, as well as Nina and Matthias. There's also a sixth main character who has not been incorporated into the show as of yet. Following the Six of Crows duology, there's also been published a second duology, beginning with King of Scars. And this one features characters both from the Shadow and Bone trilogy and the Six of Crows duology. But the events of that one occur later and are not relevant to the TV show yet. I should also mention that even though typical reading order is in publication and chronological order, starting with Shadow and Bone, I did not start the series this way. I started with the Six of Crows duology, and after finishing that, went back and read the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I did so on the recommendation of a few friends who had read all of the published books and felt that Six of Crows was a stronger book and therefore a better entry into the world. Now, if you do like I did, there would be spoilers, some direct and some implied, for the Shadow and Bone series. I don't personally mind spoilers too much, so I was willing to try it that way. Having read all the books now, I can say that the writing and the characters are much stronger in Six of Crows and King of Scars than they were in Shadow and Bone. And I've heard from some people who say that they tried Shadow and Bone and just couldn't get into it. So if that applies to you, it might make sense to try getting hooked into the world with Six of Crows and then going back and filling in some of the history with Shadow and Bone. The trilogy does get better. It kind of starts off as pretty typical YA fantasy. The middle of the second book kind of drags also. The third book is pretty solid. I think Leigh Bardugo really excels with duologies, and she probably only sold Shadow and Bone as a trilogy because it's what's expected in YA fantasy, and she was a new author. But I think the Shadow and Bone series could have been stronger as a duology. So it's pretty obvious to anyone familiar with the books that Netflix did not opt for a straight adaptation of the books in order. I mentioned that the first season covers the first book, and it does, and then some. And that's how we got 5 of the Six of Crows characters incorporated, and that is the big change that I really want to focus on because I think it made for a stronger adaptation, a better setup for future seasons, and it really ties into some things that I've been predicting for a while for the Wheel of Time adaptation. So let me talk about how these Six of Crows characters were incorporated and how those plots expanded upon the Shadow and Bone book. When Six of Crows begins, you have the characters Kaz, Inej, and Jesper, who are part of a criminal underworld in the city of Ketterdam. Gradually, over the course of the book, you get bits of each of their backstories, so you come to understand how they each came to be living as part of this gang of thieves called the Dregs. Similarly, at the start of the season, you have these three characters living in Ketterdam as part of the Dregs. However, the actual main plot of Six of Crows has not been incorporated into the show as of yet. Instead, what you see of these three characters in the first season is newly invented backstory that was created to intersect with the main plot, which centers around Alina. We also have the characters of Nina and Matthias, who are also mains in Six of Crows. And similarly for them, we are given parts of their backstories in the book. It is their backstories that form their side plot in the first season. So the Nina and Matthias part of the first season is actually the only part that's lifted directly from the Six of Crows book. And the end of the season has them basically headed into where they would each begin the beginning of the book. So if you're wondering if watching the first season would spoil you at all for Six of Crows, it's only that Nina and Matthias part that would directly spoil part of that book. Ultimately, what I'm really arguing here is that this one decision to incorporate these characters from Six of Crows and use them as B and C plots in the first season was a great decision for the adaptation, and I want to talk about why. Some of it has to do with addressing some of the weaknesses there were in that first Shadow and Bone book. Some of it has to do with different expectations for YA fantasy books versus TV fantasy series. And some of it has to do with setting up the show for a more successful run. Some of the weaknesses in character development in the book just have to do with maturity as a writer. Shadow and Bone was Leigh Bardugo's first published book. And having read the whole Grishaverse now, I can say there is a noticeable improvement in character development in each subsequent book. The other aspect, which I've already alluded to, is that I don't think there was just quite enough material in the Shadow and Bone series to really justify a trilogy. I think it would have been more tightly written if the plots of the first and second books could have been trimmed down and combined, and the whole thing could have been sold as a duology. But still, even with the opportunity to develop those characters a bit better for the TV show, you still have the issue of Shadow and Bone alone being too tightly focused on one character. This is fine and even expected for a YA fantasy book to have one main POV. But if you look at what audiences are expecting for fantasy TV, especially after the success of Game of Thrones, they're looking for more expansive, complex worlds and a diverse set of characters who intersect. Leigh Bardugo had already written some of that in her subsequent duologies. And so by incorporating some of that, we get to have a broader cast of characters. We get to see more of the world in Kerch and Fjerda as well as Ravka. And so this approach is likely to bring in and keep more viewers. And let's consider what might have happened if they had opted for a straight adaptation and just focused on Alina's story at first. They could have gotten 2, maybe 3 seasons out of that first trilogy. But what if they had wanted to continue after that? If you're going into the next book at that point, you'd be switching to a completely different set of characters in a different part of the world. It's essentially a spin-off at that point. And it's asking way more of an audience to want to continue on at that point. Instead, we're introduced to most of the main characters that might become more of a focus later on, right at the beginning, so there's plenty of time for the audience to develop an interest in them. Here's what I think might happen if the show is successful. In season 2, we seem to have been set up to continue the story with the second book in the trilogy, Siege and Storm. And the Six of Crows characters are set up to potentially begin the plot of that book. Unless they opt to develop more new material for the Six of Crows characters, it seems likely that season 2 would be a mashup of Siege and Storm and Six of Crows. And then in season 3, you could finish off the trilogy with Ruin and Rising and continue the Crows story. Depending on how far that advanced, you'd either start or potentially finish the second book in that duology, Crooked Kingdom, in season 3. But let's say they want to go beyond season 3. You have set up there to continue the Crow's story and potentially to shift to the second duology, King of Scars, which again incorporates characters both from the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and the Six of Crows duology. Overall, I'm a huge fan of this decision made by the adaptation. As a book fan, I enjoyed the new material, but I can also see how it improved upon my experience of reading Shadow and Bone, and it sets up the show nicely to continue with later material. So how does this all relate to that upcoming Wheel of Time adaptation? If you're new to my channel, you might not know that the Wheel of Time is my favorite fantasy series, and I have dug deep into everything we know about production to help me predict what we might see in that first season. If you have been following my channel, you'll know that I've been predicting for some time that the main plot of the first season is going to roughly follow the first book, The Eye of the World, but that there will be some additions and expanded storylines. To be more specific, I think the main characters in The Eye of the World, Moiraine, Lan, Rand, Egwene, Perrin, Nynaeve, and Mat, will follow roughly the same plot outline as the book. There will be changes, of course, as I have also detailed extensively, but it will be similar. This will be the A plot of the first season, similarly to the way Alina's plot was the A plot in Shadow and Bone. And I think we will have a significant secondary plot that centers around the character of Logain, and that would be sort of analogous to the B plot of the Crows in the first season. Shadow and Bone also had a C plot in Nina and Matthias, and I think we would see potentially something similar in the Wheel of Time with a plot that takes place mainly in flashbacks and centers around Moiraine, Swan, and possibly Lan. They might draw from the prequel New Spring to inform some of those flashbacks, but it's also possible that that material will extend beyond the scope of that novel. What was so interesting to me in watching Shadow and Bone is I felt like I was seeing a real example play out of pretty much exactly what I've been expecting for the Wheel of Time. A main structure that's very similar to the entry book, but with additions that bring in more characters and expand and show more of the scope of the world right from the beginning. And I was really pleased with how it played out in Shadow and Bone. It was potentially a risky decision, a big departure from the source material that might not have worked, but I think it really did. The main characters did not suffer from having some focus shifted to other characters, and the secondary characters were interesting, memorable, and had important roles to play. So it made me feel even more confident in some similar kind of strategy working for the Wheel of Time. And I think it's even less risky for the Wheel of Time because it's actually less of a departure from the source material in order to accomplish something similar. Also, I feel the setup is there for season 2 of Shadow and Bone to combine the plots of 2 books. I have been arguing for something similar in season 2 of The Wheel of Time, to combine the plots of books 2 and 3, and not to do them back to back, but as a blending. Please check out this recent video I did for more on how that might work. I hope I am right about Shadow and Bone, and we'll get to see how that plays out. Potentially, we could see season 2 of Shadow and Bone before we see season 2 of The Wheel of Time, although you never know, because we know that The Wheel of Time is currently finishing their pickups for season 1 and plans to go directly into filming season 2 after that. Either way, it should be really interesting to compare and contrast how both shows potentially craft seasons where they're combining 2 or more books into one. Overall, if you're on the fence about whether to check out Shadow and Bone or the Grishaverse books, I definitely recommend it. If you're the Wheel of Time fan who is curious about how other fantasy adaptations are being done, this is a really interesting and well done example of one. If you're a Shadow and Bone fan and aren't yet familiar with the Wheel of Time, check out my spoiler-free playlist, which will give you a lot more information on the books and the upcoming adaptation. And I couldn't recommend more highly checking out one or both of those. Soon, I will be dropping another video on the adaptation of Shadow and Bone as part of my Lessons from Fantasy Adaptations series, where I will dig into 10 of the most significant changes made from book to screen, why I think they were made, and what impact they had. I've done some other videos in that series on Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, so check those out if you haven't. Make sure you're a subscriber to this channel, like and share the video, and leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts on the Shadow and Bone adaptation if you have started or finished it. Please mark spoilers as appropriate in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.